What I was thinking of doing today was continuing on the themes that we've been discussing about culture in regards to relationships, and specifically in regards to the culture of humility and respect. And we've talked a lot about it. The reason I want to talk about it more is because I've come across some things in my study I wanted to share, but at the same time, I don't think we can talk enough about creating a culture of respect, because it's something which we often don't know how to do well. And one of the things that you may have noticed, I don't know if you are I don't know if you read much on the internet in terms of discussions that go on amongst devotees, but often when there's discussions, there sometimes is criticism. And of course criticism generally, at least as we do it in Western culture, lacks respect. There is a culture in which you can criticize or debate, but do it respectfully. But it's not so prominent in American culture. Traditionally, culture means to be humble, to respect. I was told education in Spanish or in Latin, the root of it is humility or culture. So I would say, we could say that culture means there's humility, there's respect, and so on. But sometimes in devotees' exchanges, they become quite critical, demeaning, sometimes even blasphemous, and they often attack unjustly a person because they don't believe in a person's values or philosophy, so they end up attacking the person. And of course, this is not Christian consciousness, it's not what we learn in Christian consciousness, but it's what we've learned or what we've picked up from lifetimes in the material world and from the culture in which we were raised. So I wanted to address that because I think it's really important to understand what's going on. So I read something this week which I found quite interesting. It was written, or it's from lectures by one sannyasi. He's no longer with us. His name is Mahavishnu Swami, and he was an elderly Gujarati gentleman who joined later in life, but he was raised as a Vaishnava. And all his classes were full of what you might call grandfather wisdom, very practical wisdom, and he was a very good teacher, so he made sure his students would learn what he was saying, and he made sure it was relevant. I would say he was like the ambassador of culture in his classes. So he said two things which I found interesting about why we tend to put others down. And the first thing he said is that, and I've said this also, that our senses look outward. So in other words, his point is that we see the faults of others, our senses are not looking inward, so we're not so aware of our faults. But we're aware of other people's faults, so that's what we're seeing, that's what we're confronting. But he made another point to add to this, which was quite interesting. And he said, fault finding is our predator and prey animalistic nature, because we're preying on another by fault finding. We're attacking, which is interesting when you think about it, because fault finding is an attack. So he was making the point that it's actually our animalistic side, when we fault find. And Bhaktivedanta Purnaswami was given in his class on Sunday, he was making a point which I've often made. He said that when we find fault, it's not that we should think because we're intelligent that we find fault, or we see the fault because we're smart or intelligent. That's not the reason. And although we often think that's the reason. No, there is a fault, or no one's smart enough to see the fault, but I see the fault. So my fault finding is not in any way indicative of my lower nature, it's just indicative of my sharp intelligence. It's that we should never think that way. If we look at it the way Mahavishnu Swami explains it, then I think it's accurate. It's the most accurate way we can look at it. It's our predator. We're attacking others. We're bringing others down. We're defeating. We're annihilating, defending. eating, sleeping, mating, defending. But Bhaktivedanta Purna Swami also made the point, which is very valid, that we have to learn how to associate with devotees. Because association is really the most important of all the practices of bhakti. At least it's foundational, because without association then you can't do the other practices. So a point that he's made often is that we have to learn how to associate, because when you go back to Godhead, there are going to be devotees there. And you can't go there if you don't know how to associate. So you learn how to associate here. And he made the point that one of the principles is that we should associate with more advanced devotees. But if we find fault, we may not be able to recognize who's more advanced. Because when you find fault, then you're putting yourself above somebody. And of course, when you're finding fault, it's difficult to have intimate and close and loving exchanges. I thought that interesting, that we should associate with more advanced devotees, but if we find fault with them, then you won't see that they're more advanced. Because the very act of finding fault tends to put people below yourself, at least not above you. Then, there's a story that I heard this week about Lakshmi's owl. Apparently Lakshmi rides on an owl, and wherever she goes, of course the owl takes her there. So the owl has been everywhere. He's seen and done everything. And I maybe not done everything, but he's seen everything. He's been all over material and spiritual universes. So she had this beautiful pearl necklace, and she gave it to the owl and said, I would like you to find a person who's perfect in beauty. When you find that person, give them this necklace. So the owl was traveling all over, and the owl found many beautiful people, but the owl, I think it was a she couldn't find someone who had flawless beauty, because there was always some fault. She'd find someone and think, well, this person is the most beautiful, but then she'd find some little flaw. Oh, their feet are too big for the size of their body. Oh, this person looks like the most beautiful. Oh, but their hair is not perfect texture. Like this, you'd find fault. So the whole day she looked, and then she couldn't find anybody. So she thought, well, let me think about it, and then tomorrow we'll do it. So then the owl went home, and when she saw her kid, she gave the pearl necklace to her kid. Why? Because where there's love, you don't see imperfection. So when she saw her children, because of the love, she didn't see any imperfection. And I think we all have that experience. Wherever there's affection and love, you overlook faults. So oftentimes I've made this point, and I think it's a really important point, that fault finding takes place in the absence of love. Or fault finding is a result of the absence of love, or a symptom where there is no love. Of course, sometimes, people do things wrong or upsetting, and so we see the fault, and we note the fault. But generally, very nice story. But generally, we don't find fault with people we love. Or fault finding is the absence of love, the absence of affection, or the greater the affection, the less there's the tendency to find fault, and the more there's the tendency to appreciate. So, what I've noticed within our organization, and I live within our organization, so that's where I see life. Of course, I also notice it outside our organization, but I don't live outside our organization that much. But there's a stronger tendency to condemn, to attack, to criticize and pull down and find fault than there is to honor and appreciate. So the reason that I'm focusing on this topic in relation to Vaishnava etiquette is because I see that tendency is so strong within all of us that it just naturally comes out. But I'm also seeing that the tendency to appreciate is weak. sometimes absent in the lives of many of us. And sometimes I see that there's people that I've actually never heard them appreciate another devotee. I've heard them condemn and criticize, but I've never heard them appreciate. And if we find in our own lives that that's going on for us, then we should understand that something's wrong. Something is definitely wrong. And that means our heart has become hard. That means there's a lack of love. If it's true that you don't see fault where there is love, and we are not appreciating, that means there's a lack of love. Or it means the heart has become hard. The heart has become hard. The heart has become heart. Stone-like heart, yeah. That was a slip, but we have to work with the slip to make it work. And so sometimes in Shastra we have this concept of a heart which is like stone. It lacks it lacks love, of course. That means love of Krishna. So the idea of the heart being like stone is that it lacks love. But if we use that example, we can say that if we lack the ability to appreciate, then the heart has become hard. At least we should recognize it, that it is a problem. Now, let's do some technical academic analysis here. Technically, academically, the heart of a Vaishnava has no envy. And in the beginning of Bhagavatam, it said, Nirmatsaranam Satam. Bhagavatam is for those who are not envious. And those who are not envious are devotees. So, from the textbook definition of a devotee, the textbook definition is the devotee has no envy. He's completely free from envy. That means his heart is pure. So now, we're trying to be devotees, and as I've often said, that whatever we're trying to achieve, the road to that is paved with the actions of that, whatever it is we're trying to achieve. So if we're trying to achieve a state of being non-envious, then the road to being non-envious is paved with actions, which are non-envious. That's how you get there, right? So that even if by nature we're envious, and every one of you is probably saying, but I'm envious, but I'm critical, okay. That's the whole point. We are, but we don't want to continue with that. So then our actions should manifest non-envious. Our actions should manifest freedom from envy, even if we are envious. So that's important, and it's important to understand that the tendency for that is not very strong. The tendency to criticize is very strong. As Bhaktivedanta Swami was saying, that we require the association of devotees. So to learn how to associate, it's given in a nectar of instruction. Dadati pratiganati guyam akati prachite bhunkte bhunjayate chaiva sadvidam priti lakshanam. In a sangha of devotees, you associate by giving gifts, receiving gifts, opening your heart, your mind, in confidentiality, and prasadam. Tadati pratiganati guyam akati bhunkte bhunjayate chaiva. Prasadam, yeah. So, you can see in the exchange between devotees, there's this heartfelt opening, sharing, and the word priti is used, love, exchanging of love, in the form of gifts, or you could even give your heart, express your appreciation, that's also a gift. But the point is, that's how our scriptures teach us to associate. So, Bhaktivedanta Swami's point is that we have to learn how to associate with devotees, and the association is free from criticism, it's free from envy. Now, I was reading something this morning, which I didn't fully agree with, but what I appreciated so much was the person who wrote the article was so respectful in the way he was disagreeing, which we don't see a lot, and I want to impress that upon you, that sometimes we may disagree with one another, but there's a culture in which you can express disagreement. And this article that I read, there was disagreement expressed about things that a senior devotee had said. But it was done so respectfully and so properly that no offense was made whatsoever. And I thought that's so exemplary, because you don't see that a lot. Generally, when people disagree, they can be very harsh in their words. And Krishna says, and Shastra says, speak what is priya, speak what is dear, speak what is beneficial, priya, bruyat, and satyam, speak what is truthful. But don't speak it in a way which is disturbing. So this is what our Shastra says, and this is what Krishna says is austerity of speech. Speak what is truthful, but speak what is pleasing. And Prabhupada even said in preaching that that's expertise, is get people to agree without compromising, get people to agree. But speak it in a way that doesn't upset them. So that's our austerity of speech. I may not agree with you. I may not agree with someone else. You may not agree with someone else. But how to express that in a way in which you still maintain respect for that person. That's very, very important. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that I'm not seeing a lot of this. Can we have a link to this article? It would probably just agitate your mind to read it. Because it's about something controversial. Yeah, it would agitate your mind to read it. It would confuse you also. I'm a little bit confused by it, but there seemed to be some inadvertent minimization of Srila Prabhupada in the article. And so the person who was responding to that was also expressing that maybe he didn't understand clearly the intent of the writer, but he was also expressing his own understanding of the position of Srila Prabhupada. So, but he did it so respectfully and so in such a cultured way as to not offend in any way the person who wrote the article. And it stood out as something special, because I don't see a lot of that. Unfortunately, I don't see a lot of that. And I think we can say that's ironic within the association of Vaishnavas who are meant to cultivate this kind of behavior. It said humility is the jewel of prema, and humility, of course, is one of the fundamentals of Vaishnav behavior, Vaishnav dealings, Vaishnav etiquette. And it's very much manifest in the activities of Mahaprabhu in his dealings with his devotees. And sometimes he would say, my devotees own me and I can't do anything without their permission, and always submitting to the will of the Vaishnavas. And so what we see in Chaitanya Charitamrita over and over again are devotees exhibiting great humility, great respect, and so forth. That's that's just culture. That's what it means to be cultured. You may disagree, but you just disagree in a way where you don't disrespect or fault the person. One example comes to mind in the story of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. So Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya was explaining a verse from the Bhagavatam to Mahaprabhu, and he was explaining it in an impersonal way. And so Mahaprabhu just listened, he didn't say anything for days, and then Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya said, "You haven't said anything, you haven't asked any questions. Do you understand what I'm saying?" So Sarvabhauma was just checking in, he didn't know. And he said, the Mahaprabhu said, "Well, I understand the verse, but your explanations are covering the clear meaning of the verse." That was his response. He didn't say, "Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, you are a Mayavadi, you are a fool and a rascal and a demon," etc., etc. He was very respectful because Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya was a Brahmin, Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya was a respected scholar, and he was also his superior in the sense of age. So Mahaprabhu respected that. So he didn't use derogatory language. But he did make his point, but he made it politely. That I do understand the verse, but your explanations have covered it, so I don't understand it now. And so Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya was taken back and said, what do you mean? And so then eventually Mahaprabhu, he explained his understanding, and Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya then understood that Mahaprabhu's explanation was superior. And so he was humbled by that. So Mahaprabhu didn't have to attack him. We have another example of Prakashananda Saraswati. He's a Mayavadi. He had he was a great leader of many Mayavadis, and he had met Mahaprabhu, and Mahaprabhu was dancing and chanting, and they thought, this is not proper. So they had a meeting to discuss. So Mahaprabhu, he sat down, he was invited in, and at least traditionally in India, the sannyasis would go barefoot, and so there was a place where they would wash their feet before they would go inside. So that's where Mahaprabhu sat. So, why are you sitting there? He said, I'm inferior to you. But what Mahaprabhu did is he manifested his effulgence, and they saw his effulgence. And they understood that he was special. So you can say he converted them by his effulgence. So he didn't have to tell them you are this or you are that. So my point is that there is definitely a strong tendency to do that, but that is our uncultured side. So we do have, a lot of us do have a very rough side to ourselves. And it's what Krishna describes, it's part of the qualities of the demoniac nature. It's arrogance, it's pride, it's conceit. You can see that in the Gita. In the chapter Divine and Demoniac Natures, and Krishna lists these qualities. So these are things which are part of unless you take a very high birth, this is what you get. And Prabhupada says you get it in the womb. Of course, it's not that we all have only bad qualities. But these bad qualities, we're born with many of these bad qualities. And arrogance, conceit, harshness, and so forth. It's unfortunate, but when we're provoked, this often comes out. And it's something that we really need to look at and really need to deal with if we want to create real culture, real Vaishnava culture. Now, something I've also been talking about, I don't know if I've mentioned it on these classes, but I think it's important to mention. In regards to appreciation, that what we see, both in Krishna consciousness and outside of Krishna consciousness, is that appreciation is often done, more often than not done, as far as I can tell, in a formalized way. In other words, we may have an appreciation event. We want to appreciate the devotees for their service. So let's say we have a book distribution marathon, and then after that we'll appreciate the devotees. And I think this is wonderful. Or we'll have an appreciation dinner, and we appreciate members of the congregation for their contributions financially and their service. And so then we recognize people. And it's a tradition in human society to recognize people. Graduation ceremonies or recognition ceremonies. Emmy Awards, Academy Awards, they're recognition ceremonies. You could just get an email version of your diploma and say you graduated, but there's a ceremony. So it's nice to recognize people, and it's built within cultures to recognize, to do something, to recognize the accomplishments of others. But what I would say, the problem, it's not a problem with recognizing, but outside of official recognitions, there's not enough of it done personally, one-on-one, or within normal relationships. As I often say that, if you look at the average devotee, when they're actually honored and recognized outside of if you're a book distributor or outside of some festival, when devotees are recognized, it's their death. That's when the big recognition comes in. everyone gets together to recognize them. And I think that's unfortunate. Of course, spiritual masters in our movement, they're recognized on their birthdays, but there's so many great devotees, I think it would be nice to create traditions in which others are recognized. Many devotees are recognized. Not that we should wait till they die to recognize them. I mean, it's nice that we recognize them after they leave. But I think we need to create a culture in which there's more appreciation and recognition done naturally. I think that's very important. One thing that I've observed, which is really, really interesting, and I mentioned this long ago, but I want to mention it again. I don't remember what it was, but there was a situation in which somebody was being glorified, or maybe a group of us devotees were glorifying somebody. But one of the things I noticed was that, and you've probably noticed this too, whenever a devotee is glorified, or devotees are glorified, our Krishna consciousness goes up very high, and we become very blissful. And, this always happens when we glorify a devotee. It could be anybody. It doesn't have to be Narottam Das Thakur or the six Goswamis or Srila Prabhupada. It could be even a new bhakta. If we glorify the devotee, we become very blissful, and we become very Krishna conscious by it. It's very powerful. It's said, Mahaprabhu said, glorify the devotee is the perfection of speech. So, any event that I've ever been, unfortunately, it's often an event when a devotee has left their body. When the devotee is glorified, everyone becomes very Krishna conscious. Everyone is very inspired and very happy and very peaceful. Conversely, when there's vilification of a devotee, when there's criticism, when there's fault finding, everybody feels the opposite way. Now, the trick is, and what I'm alluding to in this talk here, is the trick is how to get our consciousness or our heart in that state where we really are not attracted to speaking ill about devotees, and we're attracted to speaking well or glorifying devotees, because that's what it means to be a Vaishnava. That's like the essence of it. The essence of the heart of a Vaishnava, that he'll see what's good, just as we said, where there's love, you see what's good. And what's bad, it just doesn't really notice. Now, this is a general principle. There are bad things in the world, and we often do have to notice them, to deal with them. But I'm speaking more about the condition of the heart, in which we notice things which are not bad, as bad, or we notice things which are bad, but that's what we notice, and we don't notice to the extinction of noticing the good. Yes? And so then we run into a problem. And the problem is that that's not Krishna consciousness. Now, recently I had written an article, because there's a devotee that is living in Mauritius who just wrote me, and he was living in Bangalore. In Bangalore, there was a temple in Bangalore, which is a temple where no one gets initiated and everyone gets, well, not that they don't. Oh yeah, birthdays they glorify them, yeah. That's true. That's good. We should have more birthday parties. So Bangalore is, there are 4 temples in Bangalore, but one temple is kind of receded in a sense from ISKCON, and there everyone gets initiated by Prabhupada. So they don't allow any gurus to give initiation, and they don't believe that's what Prabhupada wanted. And I found it interesting because I wrote an article, and in writing the article I found one thing very interesting, is that you have many devotees in ISKCON who are, of course, initiating and inspiring thousands of devotees all over the world, sometimes inspiring tens of thousands of devotees. And these devotees have great affection for their disciples, and the disciples have great affection for them, and the disciples are very inspired by them. So it's a very deep relationship, and the disciples see so many good qualities in these devotees. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, though, what the Ritviks are saying is that these people were never asked by Prabhupada to be gurus, and therefore, by accepting disciples, they're disobeying Prabhupada. And sometimes they become, unfortunately, quite critical of these devotees. And so then I was thinking, now, if devotee A looks at this senior devotee, and he's told that they've done something wrong and they've usurped Prabhupada's position and so forth, then he won't be inspired by them. That he won't see them in the way that devotee B, who was not programmed to see them that way, but was just not programmed at all, was just programmed to appreciate the association of all devotees. And so devotee B can be inspired by that devotee. He can be very inspired by that devotee. He can see so many good qualities of that devotee, whereas devotee A cannot. And so in thinking about that, I thought, well, this is quite interesting, because all the devotees in category A will never be inspired by that devotee. They will not see the good qualities of that devotee. They will not appreciate that devotee. What to speak of being able to develop a relationship as a disciple with that devotee, just to see Krishna manifesting through that devotee. They won't see that. I thought that is quite interesting, isn't it? And so what does that say about the Ritvik teachings? It says that the Ritvik teachings affect the heart in such a way that the heart cannot see the positive in that person. What to speak of developing an intimate relationship? The heart cannot see the positive in that person. Isn't that interesting? It like hardens the heart. A philosophy has hardened the heart to such a degree that one will not be able to take inspiration. One will not be able to see Krishna manifest through that person. So I think this is a graphic example of what happens if we allow ourselves to hear criticism or blasphemy of another Vaishnava. Now, I have something to say which is unfortunate, but it's true. I go on some websites where some of these discussions are going on of people who oppose those who support anyone who's a guru, and people even who oppose those who support GBC, or some things that GBC says, or everything they say. And in the majority of cases, you will not find the discussions going on to be cultured. You will find them to be, how should we say, what you would not expect from those cultivating Krishna consciousness. I think you could say you would not even expect that from an ordinary person on the street. Some of the discussions are that bad. They're that blasphemous. They're that critical. They're that condescending. They're that, for lack of a better word, they're very uncultured. And I find this concerning, troubling, that within the society of devotees we would allow ourselves to degrade to that level. And then, of course, that begs the question, well, someone might say, well, are such people actually devotees? Because would devotees do that? And in one sense you could say, no, devotees don't do that. Yeah. They're a few steps below rude. Kush is saying they're very rude. Yeah, I think they're. It's amazing. So, of course, we're giving this class in Vaishnava culture, and so the point of this class is that Vaishnava culture is grounded in. It has to be grounded in humility, and we have to learn how to not agree with someone, but at the same time maintain good relationships, maintain respect. That's culture. Maintain friendliness, because, as Bhakti Vidyapura Swami was saying, we have to learn how to associate with devotees. If we don't learn how to associate with devotees, then we can't go back to Godhead, because when you go back to Godhead, there's all devotees. And if we don't like Krishna's devotees and they don't like us, then the whole thing doesn't work, and you can't get there, or if you get there, you can't stay there. So learning how to work within the association of devotees is very important. And really it comes back to what's going on within our own heart, within our own consciousness, within our own attitudes. And as we know, we have deeply ingrained samskars, which are often negative. We also have good samskars. I'm not saying that we don't have good samskars, so that many devotees have very good samskars. But if we have any kind of negative samskar, which undermines the culture of respect, which undermines the culture of humility, we need to be aware of it, and we need to work on it, because it forms the basis of all relationships within Krishna consciousness. Right? And if someone doesn't agree with us, or someone does something which we don't agree with, and that agitates us to the point where we, as Kushas, become very rude, there's something wrong with us. What the person did may be wrong, but our response, that's entirely distinct from what the person has done. So, as we say, two wrongs don't make a right. So, I'm not trying to argue that everything everybody does is perfect, that people don't do things that are wrong. That's not the point. The point is we need to learn how to respond in a Krishna conscious way when we don't agree with what other people do, or what other people say, or what other people believe. Now, recently I was reading some things by a senior devotee in our movement, and some of the things he said, in my mind, were borderline difficult to substantiate philosophically, and almost it could be seen as offensive. Let's say it that way, right? So I'll get to your question, Kush, in a minute. And so one thing I found interesting was that there was some discussion of what this devotee was saying, and some of the discussion was disrespectful. And irrespective of what the person was saying, the person's arguments may have been very good. And I know some devotees don't feel that being respectful is important. They just feel like what's important is the Siddhanta, get the truth out. And I don't agree that that's the way Prabhupada trained us. That it's just about Siddhanta. It's about relationship. Because everything is about, in Krishna consciousness, it's all about, it's not that Siddhanta exists independent of relationships, that we're just our whole concern is to understand truth. But in Krishna consciousness, it's all about relationships. That's all the Chaitanya Charitamrita. Not all of it, but so much of it is about how devotees deal with one another. So I think that's a mistake to say that it doesn't matter how we deal with one another. And I've seen this come up in arguments where devotees are trying to establish principles based on our philosophy. And they don't always present it respectfully. And people point that out to them, and they say, it doesn't matter, what I said's true. But that, I believe, is coming from a lack of culture. That's not the way things are done. It's not the way Prabhupada wants us to do things. It's not the way he trained us. So that's an important principle. Prabhupada did want us to work well together, and we do have the Nectar of Instruction as it explains loving relationships. So these things are important to understand. Yes? Yes. So, in other words, we want to accomplish so many things, and sometimes there may be debates about the best way to accomplish something. There may be debates about what Krishna consciousness is, how how it should be applied and so forth. But within that, there always has to be the culture of respect, the culture of appreciation. There can't be the culture of fault-finding and condemnation. There can't be the culture of, I'm better than you, I'm smarter than you, I know what I'm talking about. That is not Krishna consciousness, and that doesn't help us. I mentioned the Ritviks, not that I really want to dwell on them, but it was an observation that if a philosophy, and Ritvik is a philosophy, creates enmity towards Vaishnavas, then that philosophy is defective. That's proof that the philosophy is defective, because it creates enmity amongst Vaishnavas. That has to be defective. And Ritvik philosophy has created severe enmity amongst Vaishnavas. So, Kush asks the question, but they're chanting and serving, do they get benefit? Yes. Krishna always accepts everyone's service. But if one is critical of devotees, Krishna is not pleased with that service, not as pleased. In fact, Mahaprabhu says that when one offends devotees, then their chanting of Hare Krishna, the offender's chanting of Hare Krishna, is like burning cinders being thrown at my body. It's quite a heavy statement. So I had addressed this dilemma before, because we see what seems to be severe criticism, blasphemy, vilification of devotees, which is done by people who are also doing service. And so how do we understand that? Well, we understand that there's a contamination in their heart, but we also understand there's a desire to do service. And we also understand that Prabhupada's not pleased with the contamination in the heart, but he accepts their service. Now, Prabhupada told an amazing story here. Just if we look over here is where we find the Yoga Pit of Mahaprabhu, his birthplace. And that Yoga Pit was run after during the time of Bhaktisiddhanta by one of his disciples, whose dealings with the devotees were not so good. Not ideal in many ways. It seemed some of them not Krishna conscious. But Prabhupada said he went back to Godhead because of all the service he did to Bhaktisiddhanta. So, we have to see both sides of it. But there's something that I've said often, and I've been reading this lately, it keeps coming to me, which is really a nice statement, is that when you see somebody doing something that you don't approve of, then let that be a message to yourself to know that that's something I never want to do. So rather than condemn the person, just think that I want to make a note that that's something that I would never do, or I will never want to do, or that I will try my best to avoid doing because I disagree so much with it. So that is a way of seeing it. And as far as the benefit a person gets from doing service and sadhana while at the same time being critical, that's up to Krishna how he deals with that person. But if what they're doing is wrong, then we should note that at least I don't want to do that. If what they're doing is right, then we can appreciate, they're doing so many good things. But sometimes you also have the analogy that you may have a pot of sweet rice, but if you put a drop of poison in it, then it ruins it all. So sometimes a person's activities can be very poisonous, and it can ruin. To one degree or another, it can ruin the positive. So, Ganesha says, what if the person who is offending is one's own wife? Would the husband chanting still become offensive? Yeah. In other words, if a husband's offending his wife, Wives also count. They're devotees. But sometimes what we call offense to a wife is not always an offense, because the husband also loves the wife. He just might get mad at her. Offenses are more malicious, meant to bring somebody down, meant to let the world know that whatever good the person has is not good, but it's bad. Things of that nature. Now, if the wife is suffering at the hands of the husband, then obviously that's offensive and Krishna doesn't appreciate it. And whenever we cause suffering for another devotee, that suffering will come back to us. It has to be. And it does impede to some degree one's devotional service. Any activity, any action which is in passion or ignorance is going to impede your bhakti. Because at least we should live in goodness. And if we don't live in goodness and offending a devotee, harming or causing pain to another devotee is not an activity of goodness, then that's going to cause trouble to that devotee. It's going to be an impediment for their devotional service. So the offense is an impediment, and then the action is an impediment. If the action is coming from passion or ignorance, which it sounds like in this case it is, that someone's making their wife unhappy because of activities of passion or ignorance. Okay, here comes the truck. Construction is going on everywhere around here. Kush says, I know a senior devotee who speaks harshly against deviation from Prabhupada's teachings. She's always right, and every time I don't listen to her, I get into trouble. It's often hard to listen to the harsh criticism. How do I know where to draw a line in listening to her? Interesting question. See, the thing is, we discuss philosophy is one thing. If we discuss people who don't appear to be following the philosophy, then it starts bordering on offensiveness. If you speak in generally, as devotees we should do this, as devotees we should not do this, that's one thing. But if you speak more specifically how devotees in positions of, many devotees in positions of authority that I know do this, and this is wrong for these reasons, then it starts to become, it can become difficult. So as Shastra says, we don't want to hear criticism of devotees. So what do? When you see her coming, you run the other way, Kush. You tell her, oh, I've got to make a phone call, excuse me. Oh, gotta run to the bathroom. Excuse me. You want to respect the devotee's intentions. You want to respect the devotee's sincerity. These things. So you respect that. That's fine. You respect those things. May not appreciate how it comes out, but you respect the mood. That's how I would take it. And if I can't run away to the bathroom or to make a phone call, but at least Prabhupada's instruction in this regard was that whatever it is that we want to see, whatever it is we want to see, then we do that ourselves. And I think really, if we wanted to boil down this discussion to the essence, I think what we want to see is how we can create environments where we all encourage one another. Everybody's encouraged, everyone is honored, everyone feels welcome. It's very, very important, because we know if we're not careful, we can create environments where everyone doesn't feel welcome, everyone doesn't feel encouraged, everyone doesn't feel inspired. And so it's extremely important that within our communities, that within our Sangha and association, everyone is inspired to serve Krishna, because it's only by serving Krishna that we're going to become purified. And it's greatly unfortunate if people come into our association and they're not inspired to serve Krishna. It's greatly unfortunate if they come into our association and they hear criticism of other devotees, or worse still, that they become critical of other devotees. Kush says, in the Vedic wedding, one of the samskars, the husband says to the wife, now that she has more faults, so he can't criticize her. I don't understand. No more faults. Oh, I have no more faults, so he can't criticize her. Yeah. You see, the point is, if there's criticism, it should have some redeeming value, and if it doesn't have redeeming value, then why use it? Just as a means of expressing your own passion or ignorance, your own frustration. Okay. If you express it realistically and say, I'm frustrated because I see devotees acting in certain ways and it's disappointing and discouraging, Okay, that's all right, because now you're expressing, the challenge that you're facing and dealing with it. But expressing it, that these devotees are always doing this, and this is so bad, and what's going on in our movement, and we're worse than the non-devotees and so forth. That doesn't help. Because you also have the apichet siddharacharo verse, whereas you're meant to see the real heart and intention of the devotee. And the heart, if the heart and intention is in pure devotional service, and the activities may not be in pure devotional service all the time, but you're meant to see the heart and intention, and therefore see the devotee as a sadhu. So that's also something we consider. In this verse, api chet siddharacharo bhajate mamananyabhak saroreva samandhanam vivastito hisa. Krishna is saying that even a devotee does something which is socially unacceptable or what might be considered even abominable, consider him a sadhu since he's rightly situated. And so rightly situated is explained by Vishwanath Chakravarti that he's remorseful when he does something wrong. That he knows he did it wrong. He knows he's done something wrong. He is remorseful about it. And his only desire of his heart is to serve Krishna. So we also have to see that side of it. If that's where a devotee's heart is, then we appreciate the heart, because the heart is everything. What you do externally may be perfect, may not be perfect. But if your heart is in the perfect place, then you'll come to perfection. And that's the most important thing. So, we are going to end here because we have used up our 1 hour. We've used up our 60 minutes. One of the things that I am trying to do is create communities in which everyone finds their service, everyone appreciates others' service, where no one feels a need to have to put anybody down to justify their position, but rather one feels a desire to appreciate in another service, one feels a desire to help another in their service. And that's Krishna consciousness, and that's how we're going to spread Krishna consciousness. It's really interesting if you want to, just like for the sake of discussion, we can talk about management. Well, what's the best way to manage a temple, or what's the best management theory? But in Krishna consciousness, the management theory is that we appreciate and encourage and facilitate one another's service. That's Krishna conscious management. That's what it's all about. And we can achieve success other ways without doing that, because we may know how to manage on a material level. So we get things done. Things happen. We move things. But that's not the way we're supposed to do it, just move things. We're supposed to create an environment in which all of us are inspired to serve. And that's what Prabhupada tried to do as much as possible. And if we were discouraged by other devotees, then Prabhupada was upset. He wanted us to encourage everybody. And that's what it means to be a leader, to give inspiration and to facilitate another's service, to help sometimes to help people see how they can better serve, and then facilitate it, and then encourage it, and then guide it. And that's real leadership. That's real management. So that we never want to manage in a way that doesn't happen. That would be unfortunate. So in all our management, everything we do, we want to keep the relationships healthy. We want to inspire one another. We want to somehow be able to work with one another in a way that we can be happy and others can be happy. Now, we know that's not always easy. We know we all have our own natures and so forth. So it does take work internally within us to detach ourselves from those things within us which would make it difficult to do. But anyway, that's part of the work. But I think in ending this class, it's important to re-emphasize the fact that if there's a tendency for fault-finding, if there's a tendency to not appreciate, then we shouldn't look at it as a fault of another person. Well, Prabhu, if you had more good qualities, I could appreciate you. But we should look at it as a fault within ourselves. right? It's not that the fault is that the person doesn't have qualities which we can appreciate. The fault is we're not seeing those as the fault. The fault's with us. I'm seeing the fault. That's the fault. If I see a fault, that's my fault. If I see the good, that's because of the good in me. And we have to understand that. But we don't always understand that. That's the problem. If I keep seeing fault, then I should think, okay, what's the fault in me that I'm seeing fault? If I keep seeing the good, then I should think, okay, this is the right consciousness. This is good. That means I must be doing something right because I'm appreciating. And two people can look at the same thing, as I said. One sees one thing and one sees another. And so, there's a saying, you don't see things as they are, you see things as you are. So if we're seeing things negatively, it's a reflection that we have a negative attitude. That's how we should see it, right? Because we don't see the things as they are, we see things as we are. So if I'm seeing everything positively, that must mean I'm positive. If I'm seeing things negatively, it must mean I'm negative. Otherwise, how is it someone may say, but there are negative things. Okay, that may be. But does everyone in the world see those things in the same way? No. Does everyone see the negative negatively? No. Because, like Prabhupada said, he said, he never got encouragement from his God brothers, but he was always encouraged to go on because he was encouraged by his spiritual master. So even though there was negative, he wasn't negative. So that's the point. So, you may have justification to be negative because there's negative things going on. But internally, we need to be positive. And so even in spite of the negative, we can somehow or other be positive. We can see, okay, it's bad here, it's bad here, bad here. But right in the middle, I can find something. I can find some service or something. So things can be positive. Does that make sense? There's always, positive or negativity is not always objective. I mean, objectively, there are positive things and there are negative things. But our state of consciousness is a reflection of our own internal doings, our own internal attitudes. So, do I have your permission now to end class?